I want to do a very brief introduction to you all in EBSynth in case you want to use EBSynth or EBSynth. And but first, I want to talk a little bit about frame rates just to make sure that we understand them and to see that there's kind of two ways that we can work with frame rates here in After Effects. So I'm going to import my piece of footage. I can just drag and drop if I want to do that. And this is footage of my puppy. It is shot at 1920 by 1080, and that is a good size for a composition. So I'm just going to drag that in. All right. So I'm going to duplicate this to show you something here. If I duplicate, I can do Command D, and now I have a second piece of footage. It's the same thing. So this one is 30 frames a second. And then this one is also 30 frames a second. But I can come in here and remember there's something called interpret footage. I can go to main and I can change this to be at a different frame rate if I want to. So I'm going to change this to 12 frames a second. And if I were to drop this into my composition now, my second piece of footage, I'm going to put it on top. What do we expect to happen? It's going to be a lot longer because I'm now spreading out my instead of grouping my frames into like containers of 30, now I'm only grouping my frames into containers of 12, and so it goes a much further amount, and we can see that it goes over the edge. So I'm going to come here, composition settings, and I'm going to change this to let's say 10 seconds. And if I zoom out, there we go, we can see this piece of footage is a lot further, but it also kind of looks like it's moving in slow motion, right? So that kind of depends on like any piece of footage is probably going to, when you play it back at 12 frames a second, it's probably going to look more slow motion. If we were to come in here and just change it to 24, what's going to happen down here? It's going to shorten, and it's also going to play at a more normal speed. But of course, it was shot at 30, so this is what the 30 looks like. But the important thing to know here is when we render this, so we go back to composition settings. When we render out this composition, regardless of if this is set to 12 frames a second or 24 or 30, what the final movie is going to render at is 30 frames a second. So in our composition settings, this is where we change how we want it to render. And if we change this frame rate right here, it's not going to do anything about affecting the actual time of our footage. This footage is going to stay the same no matter what. And you can see if I change this to 12, it's still about 3 seconds. I'm going to Command Z here, and you can see it goes over 3 seconds. If I do that again, composition settings, change this to 12, it's going to be over 3 seconds. It's 3 seconds and 4 frames. And you can also see it's not necessarily looking like it's in slow motion. I'm going to turn it off and look at the 30 frames one. It doesn't necessarily look like it's in slow motion like it did before. What it is doing is it's just dropping frames. So it might look a bit more fragmented or a little less smooth than it did in our previous 30 frames a second composition, right? Because now we're only seeing 12 frames per second. And so let's just make a new comp. So Theo2, and let's change this back to 30. And I'm going to drag my 30 frames a second in here. So we can see that's pretty smooth. But if I go over here, this is my 12 frames a second version. See, it looks a little more choppy, a little more fragmented. It's not, we don't have as many frames to see, so it's not as clear in regards to like, yeah, we're just not seeing every frame. So I hope that makes a little sense that when we come into our composition settings, when we change this, it's never actually going to adjust the amount of time of our footage. A piece of footage will be the same amount of length in a composition that is 30 frames a second versus if it's in a composition that's 12 frames a second. What's going to change the amount of time that our footage actually takes up is when we come in here and go to main interpret footage and we change this. And if we have a piece of footage that is shot at 30 frames a second and we lower it to 12, it's going to take longer. If we have a piece of footage that's shot at 60 frames a second and we lower it to 24, it's going to look like it's in slow motion, right? We could also kind of do the reverse, and we could, if we had something that was shot at 30 frames a second. I've never tried this before, but I assume, I don't know, maybe you could play it at 60 frames a second and then it would go faster, right? Okay. So the reason that I wanted to show you this was because I want to render this out. I want to get a new render of my footage, and let's keep the piece of footage here that is at 24 frames a second. I like that. I think it's a good speed. And I like the speed at which it's playing at. That's a reasonable speed. It doesn't look like it's moving in super slow motion, though it is slightly slower than what 30 frames a second would be. But I don't want to deal with as many frames as the render will produce if it is producing, if it's at, sorry, I forgot that this was at 12 frames a second. So if it was at 24 frames a second, we would have a lot more frames to deal with. I want to render it out and render it as 12 frames a second. So this is great. This will give me less frames to deal with. So this is kind of a preparation for how we start. So I'm just gonna move this into Adobe Media Encoder Queue. So when I'm saving this, I want to go into my file directory, hit new folder, and I'm going to say, I'm going to call this the video. So just vid, and I'm going to save. So this is here. I don't want to make an H.264. I'm going to come in here and change this. I don't want the audio, no need for that. And oh, well, I'm going to make a PNG sequence. That's what I want to show you, is that instead of H.264, we come down here and we do a PNG sequence. And that will be fine. So I'll hit OK. And here I'll just show you the difference. So I'm going to change this back to 30 frames a second. Again, the time did not change, but I'm going to add it to my encoder queue. I'm going to change the location. I'm going to make a new folder called vid2, just so I can show you. I'll hit save. PNG sequence, that's great. So when I come into my folders, so now I have these image sequences, and we can see the 12 frames a second one goes to 38, which is manageable in my opinion. The vid2, this is our 30 frames a second, goes to 97. So it's a lot more frames that we would be dealing with. And in any circumstance where we're doing anything sort of frame by frame and using references, then this is something to consider. And do you really care if it has the crispness of a 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second project versus if it could work at 12 frames a second? So the next step, we have the video references that we have the image sequence that we want to use in EBSynth. And this image right here, the first image is the image that I'm going to use to color on top of, paint on top of, and it's going to use that image that I paint on top of this to create the rest of the video. So I just painted the image on top of this. And I want to save this file as the same extension that I had for my video, which was PNG. So let's make it a PNG. And it has to also have the same name. So I'm just going to save that, and I've put it in this new folder right here, and that's the painting file. This is the file that I'm going to use. An important note is that it has to have the same name. So this is referencing this, and then also it has to be the same size. So if the video is 1920 by 1080, this also has to be 1920 by 1080, right? So now we can actually start EBSynth. And we can, what we're going to do is we're going to pull the keyframe into this first one. I keep calling it EBSynth. I think it's just EBSynth. So this is the keyframe. Make sure that I'm selecting the right one. Yes. And then the video. Select the right one. Great. Now this is going to tell you where the keyframe is and which direction it's going to move to finish the project. So remember when we were in here, we had 38 frames, so it's going to go all the way to 38. And these numbers over here kind of adjust a little bit of the emphasis that it places. So if you want more emphasis on the video or more emphasis on the keyframe, let's change it to that. I haven't messed with these yet, so I don't really know how it will affect it. But now we can hit synth. And this is just dealing with one keyframe. If I had multiple keyframes, I would add another. But for now, I want to run it and see what happens. So I'll run it and pause and come back. Pause. You can also see here the output. So see, it just created this new output, basically. It created this folder. That is where the new folder was created. You can see what's starting to happen. It is already starting to reference and create new frames. And so we have 38 of these to go. So you can see it's still running, but I have 21 frames now. We can see a significant difference. And if I come into After Effects, I can start to import this and see how it's working if I want to. So I can come here, Command I, and I'm going to go to Out and start here. And I do want to import it as a PNG sequence. you can see when I import it, it's only gone up to 24 frames. If I right click and say reload footage, it's going to bring in more that have rendered. So now it's up to 31 and it will keep going. So we can drop this down and we can see how it plays if we want. So interesting. Now a PNG sequence has the exact same capabilities as a video file. So I can right click on this, interpret footage, main, and so I don't want it to play at 30 frames a second because remember we rendered it at 12 and I think the piece of footage was at 24 frames. So we can just mess around with this and see what we want basically. So if I change this to 12 frames a second, it's going to get longer. And maybe this is a speed that we like more. Now it's starting to get really mixed together, and I know that this is partially a result of maybe changing the numbers. Also, it's beneficial to make a second keyframe at some point in time so that it has more to reference. And I did this ahead of time already, but that process, obviously I didn't record. And so I want to show you some of the stuff that I already did and how it can also look then. So I'm going to pause. So this is a previous render that I made, and it's a little less messy. His head kind of stays more in its shape, but again, we would probably do another keyframe at some point right here where we see more of the front of his head. But so I also decided I'm not really sure I enjoyed this background that I created. So I figured I could use a matte, which we've talked about, make an alpha matte, and put this on top of my footage. And then I can do alpha matte. And now it's gotten rid of the background that I've created. And there is a way to do this directly in EBSynth right here with mask, but I'm showing you how I did it. So this was my matte, and these are my frames, and this is the process that I showed you before. What I did was I duplicated my video folder, and I made it my matte folder instead. And so what I essentially did was come into my image. Same thing, I did the object selection. And I shift selected the toy. I added the mask, and then I came in here and painted out the bits that I did not want to keep. And then I would file, save as, and I made sure to save it in the matte folder and save it as a PNG. And I kept the same name as well, just making sure that I put it in this. I'm sorry, I kept it as a Photoshop file, actually. The Photoshop file, remember, it allows me, if I wanted to, I could come in here and I could change some of the mask later. We looked at how the mask updated in that one demo, right? So then I did that. Again, so I think this was about 30 times. Yeah. So it did, here we are in the map. It took a little bit of time to select each time, but that created this version right here where we have Theo isolated. And as long as it's lined up with our original piece of footage from EBSynth, it mats on top. And then I was able to come in here and, oh, that's not the right thing. I was just able to come in here and like add a shape layer. I made a new comp. The comp names in this are bad. I'm sorry. It doesn't make much sense. But I made a new comp, which was this comp 201, and I dropped comp 2 in here. This was comp 2, right? So comp 201, and then I added a shape layer underneath. I can do that by going up to layer, new, shape layer. It's added on top, and I could change the color. If I double click on the square, it's just going to fill. Now I would drop this down underneath. So those are some options for how we could use EBSynth and also do some matting. I will, if we have a green screen, then there's going to be an easier way to do the matting in EBSynth, which we will take a look at as well. So I hope you find this interesting. Now, like I find with the background gone that maybe it feels, I don't know, to me it feels more interesting. We could explore how we use this in more interesting ways now. Like we could animate the dog a bit more if we wanted to. Theo, he's walking around right now. There we go. So, hey. So we could have the dog slide across screen. We could have the dog rotate. He's hungry. Hey. We could spin it, something crazy like that. We could also do the like multiplication sort of thing where we kind of delay and multiply and slide down. Theo, hush. So if I shift select both keyframes and then move them, it will move the entire path. And I could come in here. You all know that I like to just sort of mess with color adjustment. So we could like just change this to a different color dog. I guess it seems very sort of like pop art to me. But when I think when we're starting to do this and we're able to again sort of like isolate the asset, um, it offers this new ability to start collaging in a new way. And I also think it takes it away a little bit from the certain look that EBSynth creates, which I think is capable of creating a lot of looks. But yeah, it's just makes it you're able to use it in a different way. So I hope that provides a little bit of the EBSynth process. And if you're interested in using it, keep exploring it. We'll talk more about it.